Okay, good evening everybody. My name's Peter Murphy from the Politics in the Pub Committee. I want to welcome you all here tonight for another very compelling discussion in our progressive and democratic approach to these sort of topics. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to their elders past and present. The topic tonight is global refugee crisis. Millions of people on the move in Europe, Middle East and Africa. How well is the Western world, including Australia, responding? So we have two very fine speakers tonight. I'll introduce them now. The first is John Dowd, who is committed to advancing the global cause of human rights. He's a former Justice of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Attorney General and leader of the New South Wales Opposition, and holds a number of appointments within Australia and internationally. Back in 1973, John Dowd joined the International Commission of Jurists, Australia, and subsequently was elected President. In 1999, he was appointed an International Commissioner of the ICJ and elected Chairperson of the ICJ Executive Committee in Geneva from 2002 to 2009. He was elected Vice President of the International ICJ in 2008 until he retired from that post in 2014. In 2015, he was made an honorary life member. He's carried out missions for the ICJ, including to the Philippines in 1977, Hong Kong in 1991, East Timor in 2000, Nepal in 2003, and several times to Indonesia. In 1996, John led the Australian government delegation to Palestine to monitor the Palestinian Legislative Council elections and assisted in establishing the procedures for the Palestinian Legislative Council. In 2005, John was appointed Protection Ambassador for Auscare, subsequently a Director, a Vice President in 2008, then President of its successor organisation, Action Aid Australia, in July 2009. John Dowd has been honoured with the Queen's Silver Jubilee Medal, created a Knight Commander of the Filipino Order of the Knights of Rizal, appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia. He was awarded the Centenary Medal in 2001 and the Australian National Service and Defence Jubilee Medal in 2008. And in 2009, he was invested with the insignia of the Order of Timor-Leste. So a very distinguished speaker. Paul Power, our second speaker this evening, has been Chief Executive Officer of the Refugee Council of Australia since 2006. The Refugee Council is the national umbrella body for 200 agencies working with refugees and asylum seekers. Paul leads the organisation's policy development and public education on refugee issues and its advocacy with the Australian Government, international networks and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Since 2012, Paul has served as a steering committee member of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. Paul has served as a member of the Australian Government's Refugee Resettlement Advisory Council from 2008 to 14 and co-chair of the Global Working Group on Resettlement and the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement in 2011-12. Prior to joining the Refugee Council, Paul was working in the NGO sector as a media officer, trainer, researcher and manager after a 12-year career in the newspaper industry as a journalist and editor. Through his NGO work, Paul has been involved with projects in international aid, community development, mental health support, volunteer training, social research and advocacy. So again, really from the inside of this issue, we're going to get a very informed point of view. So please, if you haven't done it already, switch off or turn down your mobile phones. Each speaker has 20 to 25 minutes and then we have a 10-minute break, after which there is an open mic question and answer session through to our 8:15 p.m. finish. Wyn Childs from our committee will make a short announcement about our need for donations before the break. And the first speaker we have this evening is Paul Power, so now please welcome him to the microphone.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that welcome, and I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are tonight, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. As Peter mentioned, my organisation, the Refugee Council of Australia, is an umbrella body working with organisations that provide direct services to refugees and asylum seekers, a network that's been around for 35 years. and we're very actively involved not only in domestic policy development and advocacy on asylum seeker and refugee issues, but also involved in the Asia-Pacific question and also refugee questions, and also in global discussions and debates, particularly about refugee resettlement and its role as a durable solution. But tonight, I mean, there are many things that I could focus on, and tonight I thought I would think specifically about the impacts of the Syrian refugee crisis, because it's front of mind for the world at the moment and has been for a little while, but unfortunately it's only one of a number of serious refugee crises, and there are a series of largely unacknowledged crises happening across Central Africa and the Horn of Africa, and also into the Middle East, other parts of the Middle East in areas such as Yemen. But because there has been so much discussion about the Syrian refugee question, and because it's been so Europe-centred, I thought it would be useful just to make some observations of the crisis, from an Australian perspective, but also from a visit that I was able to make to Lebanon for several days in December, and following up a visit the previous year to Jordan, to Amman, and to the Zatri refugee camp inside Jordan, close to the Syrian border. I think one of the sad aspects of the Syrian refugee crisis is it's only come to world attention when the crisis started to have a big impact on Europe. The crisis has been running at a high level since 2011, but it was really during 2014 and particularly during 2015, as the tens of thousands of Syrians moving on to Europe became hundreds of thousands, that the world started to take notice. And of course, by then, so much damage had been done, and so many lives had been deeply scarred by the crisis in Syria, and also by the desperate yearning for protection in countries within the region and beyond. And I think it's very easy for us to overlook the incredible pressure that countries around Syria are under. UNHCR statistics show that as of Monday, Syria's neighbours in the Middle East and Turkey were hosting 4.8 million officially registered refugees. Now, in Turkey alone, there are 2.7 million officially registered refugees. And I say officially registered refugees because there's an unknown number of unregistered refugees in each country. And most of those 2.7 million refugees in Turkey have arrived within the last 18 months. And tens of thousands are continuing to arrive each week and each month at the moment. Lebanon, where I had the opportunity to visit, has close to 1.1 million officially registered Syrian refugees, but probably many more, perhaps closer to 2 million Syrians within the country. Some of them who have some form of residency status, and an increasing number of unregistered refugees within the country. Now, unless you've actually had a close connection with Lebanon or been there, you probably might not be aware of exactly how small it is. If you put Lebanon in New South Wales, it would fit between the centre of Newcastle and the centre of Wollongong, and between Penrith and Bondi. The population of Lebanon is just a little more than Sydney, around 4.6 million people, and it is hosting 1.1 million officially registered refugees, and perhaps closer to 2 million. Just looking at that official figure, on a per capita basis, if that was applied to Australia, it would be equivalent to us hosting 5.5 to 6 million refugees. Now, can you imagine how the Australian population would respond to that? So I think we have to acknowledge the incredible role that countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, even northern Iraq and Egypt are playing in hosting large numbers of Syrian refugees, but also recognise that those countries are under enormous pressure, and of course it's certainly not a bed of roses for anybody involved in those questions, both the local populations and the Syrian refugees who've moved there. In Australia, we have this view that refugees are safely housed within camps and that their needs are met. But the reality in the Middle East and in most parts of the world is that the vast majority of refugees are not in camps. In fact, the latest statistics from UNHCR say that on a global level, only 28% of the world's refugees live in camps. And if you the only region of the world where most refugees are actually in camps is in Africa. Once you actually exclude Africa from the question, it's less than 20%, less than 1 in 5 of the world's refugees live in camps. Now that's both a good thing and a very bad thing simultaneously. Those who live in camps actually have highly restricted freedom of movement, but those who live outside the camps are often left with little or no support and have the problem of supporting themselves and also supporting their living costs, including their rental costs, wherever they happen to be living, week in, week out. And this is a huge pressure in Lebanon. There is not a single one of those 1.1 million Syrian refugees who's living in an official camp in Lebanon. The percentage in camps is 0. In the Middle East, in total, only 10% of Syrian refugees are actually living in formal camps. There are what people refer to as camps in Lebanon, but they're actually empty blocks of land that enterprising landlords are leasing to impoverished refugees for them to put tents on. So they are actually not in any way organised, and the living conditions are amongst the worst for refugees within the country. So people who've fled to Lebanon are trying to find housing within a country which clearly has not had the opportunity to expand its housing stock to meet the demand. And so you have most people living in apartments with whole families in single rooms, so a 3-bedroom apartment, commonly would host 3 families, sometimes even more than that. People living in uninsulated garages and sheds, and as you would be aware, the climate in Lebanon, both in summer and in winter, is quite fierce. So the situation that people are in is really, really difficult, and the cost of living is very high. Many of the things that you would purchase in Beirut, you're probably paying an amount fairly close to what you would pay in Australia. And all of these 1.1 million refugees are trying to find a way to survive financially within the country, and clearly they're not. And in fact, UNHCR's surveying of the needs of refugees within Lebanon shows that year by year the situation financially for them gets worse, gets more desperate. So much so that there are many people within Lebanon at the moment, many Syrian refugees who'd like to be able to move on to Europe, but they have absolutely no means to do so. The most recent survey that UNHCR had completed just before I met their programs and resettlement staff there in Lebanon showed that 52% of Syrian refugees were in what UNHCR classified as extreme poverty. That's living on less than about $4 Australian per person per day. And the previous year, that figure had been 29%. So extreme poverty had risen from 29% to 52% in 12 months. And poverty, which they define as people living on less than about $5.50 Australian a day, per person per day, is at 70%, and it had been just under half a year before. 89% of Syrian households are in debt, and that average debt is now well over $1,000 Australian dollars, and growing by the month. And average family income for a family of 5 is just $220 per month. And in fact, when you look at the situation that people are in, the sums just don't add up. Average family income for a household is $220 per month. What I'm told is that the cost of renting a tent on an empty block of land is about $140 a month. To rent a room in Beirut, it would be somewhere between $300 and $700 per month. So what's been happening is that the Syrian refugees within Lebanon are drawing on all of their financial reserves, and actually now got to the point, because many of them in Lebanon have been displaced for 3 or 4 years, where they've run out of money and they're actually having to borrow in order to survive. So they're trapped, very much trapped. And it's a situation where, there is certainly a level of welcome, but there's also, as you could imagine, in this, small country with limited resources and dealing with greater overcrowding than they've dealt with before, there is also a level of community resentment. In fact, the community concern about the Syrian refugees hit a watershed in 2014 when the official number of registered refugees within Lebanon passed 1 million. It was regarded both politically and by many in the community as really a bridge too far. And from that point, the political attitude and much of the community attitude towards welcoming Syrian refugees shifted towards trying to find ways to shut the border, to exclude people and to make life tougher. There was even a movement in 2014, a community movement, to try to actually force Syrian refugees back into Syria, but fortunately that didn't gain too much popular support, but it was certainly, from what I'm told, a significant political movement at the time. Of course, with such a large population living in such a small country, there are all sorts of challenges with basic services, and one of them one of the biggest challenges has been for schooling for young Syrian refugees. They've have to try to meet the needs of 400,000 school-aged Syrian refugees within the country. And with some international assistance, the Lebanese Ministry of Education has set a goal of trying to create 200,000 additional places in its public schools and its poorly resourced public schools. At the last report, they have managed to provide schooling for about 140,000 Syrian refugee children. So that means that there is 260,000 or so Syrian refugee children of school age who actually have no schooling at all. So it's not only a matter of the capacity of the school system to be able to cope with the children, but also the capacity of families to be able to cover the cost of transport to school and back each day. So to actually achieve those 140,000 extra places, Lebanese schools are now actually operating 2 shifts a day, with a separate shift in the afternoon for Syrian children, and have brought forward the schooling of Lebanese children to the morning. They haven't been able to incorporate the two groups of students because in Syria the education is purely in Arabic, and in Lebanon it's both in Arabic and French, and have found that the Syrian students were actually unable to survive within a bilingual education system. In Lebanon, the health system is very much privatised, where it's very much a public health system in Syria. So Syrian people are used to being able to get government subsidised assistance with healthcare, and they're finding that their capacity to be able to afford healthcare of any sort in Lebanon is extremely limited. And there are many anecdotes of people going back into Syria, back into the civil war, to get critical medical assistance back in their home country because they can't afford that care within Lebanon. And under the current rules that operate within Lebanon, they can't come back. Once you leave Lebanon now, after the change of policy in 2014, you cannot go back into the country unless you are on your way to somewhere else. And so there is a steady stream of people directly from Syria into Tripoli in the north of the country onto a ferry into Turkey. And these are people who've realised that they actually have no future within Lebanon, and they're actually trying to get to Turkey and potentially to Europe. But the other 1.1 million officially registered refugees remain in the country and are very much stuck, both physically and economically, by the situation. There's also, of course, things that are happening within Lebanon which are upsetting the local population. You know, there are anecdotes within Lebanon and also within Jordan of landlords kicking out long-serving tenants and replacing them with 3 or 4 families, and quadrupling the rent. There's a lot of concern about the fact that Syrian refugees, many of whom don't have full registration or full permission to work, actually working for half the rates of Lebanese employees. And so this is obviously, you have one group of people who are struggling to survive and others who are feeling that the long-term residents who are feeling that their position within their own society is being threatened. So in that context, the need for the international community to assist is far, far greater than is widely recognised within Australia. Also, I think it's important to acknowledge that the movement of Syrian refugees into Europe has actually been a small proportion of the whole phenomenon. So the latest statistics from UNHCR up until the end of December show that over 5 years there have been 898,000 Syrian asylum applications, as opposed to 4.8 million officially registered refugees who have remained within the Middle East. But of course, what we're seeing in Europe is a broader movement of people. Syrians make up just under half of the refugees and asylum seekers moving into Greece. There are also very significant numbers of Afghans and Iraqis, and even some Iranians and Pakistanis amongst that movement. But the movement of people from North Africa into Italy is very much an African displacement phenomenon. In fact, there are very few Syrians at all within that movement. So Europe definitely has received very large numbers of people who've arrived by boat, just over 1 million last year in total, and 154,000 so far this year, most of them into Greece. But, you know, in numerical terms and in terms of where the pressure is greatest, the pressure remains greatest in the Middle East. And of course, what we've seen is a number of countries talk about refugee resettlement, and as of the latest estimate from UNHCR about the number of resettlement places that have been offered over about 3 or 4 years is 170,000 in total globally for the countries of the Middle East. And UNHCR is trying to push as hard as possible to create more opportunities for those places to be available. And that 170,000, of course, includes places that have been pledged that, and we're yet to see those places fully taken up. And of course, our organisation has been involved just in the last couple of weeks in drawing attention to the fact that Australia's performance in actually following through on its promise in September to resettle an additional number of 12,000 Syrian and Iraqi refugees, which record to date has been abysmal. You know, in the Senate Estimates Committee hearing about 3 weeks ago, the Secretary of the Department of Immigration acknowledged that the total number of the 12,000 who had been pledged to come to Australia, who had actually made it to the country, was just 26. In early November, you'd be aware that a new government took office in Canada. Justin Trudeau was Prime Minister, and he promised during the election campaign that he would resettle 25,000 Syrian refugees by Christmas. He only took office in about the first week of November. They actually revised that to the end of February, and on the 28th of February they passed the 25,000 mark. So this is a country which faces exactly the same issues that we do in terms of the processing of applications for refugee resettlement, has the same questions and fears within its population about health checks and security checks, has potentially the similar sort of bureaucratic processes, and they were able to achieve 25,000 resettlement arrivals in 4 months, and in 5 months Australia had achieved 26. Even New Zealand is doing better than Australia at the moment. So I think, clearly, not only should Australia, lift its game in actually living up to its current promises, but also it needs to look in the short to medium term at how we're going to provide longer term assistance to countries in the Middle East and elsewhere that are just under unimaginable pressure. And I think one of the interesting things is that we're actually even hearing in some of our dialogue with some of the business lobbies that they recognise that Australia globally has to do more for humanitarian purposes, but also for Australia's international reputation than we are currently doing. The other aspect which is really, really troubling about this international effort to assist the countries in greatest need is that UNHCR last year, for UNHCR and the NGOs that it works with, set a budget of $6 billion to assist all of the displaced people and refugees in Syria and in surrounding countries. And they actually only achieved 62% of that target. So in Australian dollars, they were $2.3 billion short of the programs that they had set themselves as the needs that they had actually anticipated for the 2015 calendar year. So while there's a lot of angst about the impact of this movement of refugees into Europe, I mean, the fact remains that the countries which are pretty quietly bearing the greatest responsibility for this international failure in terms of peace and reconciliation, but also in terms of humanitarian assistance. Those countries are really struggling, and the level of effective assistance to the countries in the front line of refugee movements in the Middle East and elsewhere is really pitiful. Thank you.